Check that out, that's the new Polar Vantage M3. And this watch is super interesting because the M series from Polar has not been updated in a few years, ever since the Polar Vantage M2 came out a couple of years ago. And in that time frame from the M2 to the M3, a lot has changed in the world of technology and wearables, and Polar's implemented a lot of new stuff under the hood on the new M3, and that's what we're gonna talk about today. I've been using the new Polar Vantage M3 for a few days now. I haven't had it for a super long time, so I'm not gonna call this an in-depth review or anything like that, but I have been wearing it non-stop, 24/7, taking it on my everyday runs, using all the features just to test out what it's capable of. And I'll just spoil this right off the bat and tell you that the Polar Vantage M3 is basically a stripped down version of the Polar Vantage V3, and the Polar Grid X2 Pro basically has the same software and all the same features at a lower price point. Before I get ahead of myself though, let's talk about the pricing and options. The new Polar Vantage M3 will be coming in at $399 here in the USA, and there will be two colors available at the time of launch. There's gonna be this gray version, it's kind of a beige version. They call it grayish sand that I have here, and then there's a night black option as well. Now that $399 price point is particularly important because again, the software on the Vantage M3 here is basically identical to the more expensive Grid X2 Pro here, which costs $749, and the Vantage V3 here that costs $599. During the media call I was on where Polar was sort of explaining all the new features of this watch, Polar was sort of explaining that this watch was sort of designed for women and also men who don't like a larger watch. For example, the Polar Vantage V3 and the Grid X2 Pro here are kind of chunky watches. They're both like 45 to 46 millimeters in diameter. The Grid X2 Pro in particular has this big chunky bezel on it, and that's not for everybody. If you want a more subtle experience or a smaller watch on a smaller wrist, these two watches were kind of hard to swallow, even if you really liked the Polar ecosystem. And that's where the Polar Vantage M3 comes in, because this watch comes in at a smaller 44 millimeters in diameter, and it's only 12 millimeters thick. And as you can see here on the desk with all these watches side by side, it is considerably smaller. And if I put the watches on their sides here, you can see that the Vantage M3 is also the thinnest of the bunch, and it's also pretty lightweight. This watch comes in at only 53 grams. Even though the Polar Vantage M3 is sort of the budget option in the Vantage lineup, it still has premium materials. So you are dealing with a Gorilla Glass lens here. You don't get sapphire on this watch, which is sort of a trade-off for that lower price point and the lighter weight. And then you do have a stainless steel bezel on the front here. And on this grayish color, it is a gold sort of color. The side here, the buttons all have a gold accent to them, except for the center button, which is red. And then you got gold buttons on the other side as well. As you've probably noticed already, this watch does have a 5-button layout. You've got 3 on the right here and 2 on the left. And this is similar to other Polar watches like the Grid X2 Pro here. The nice thing about having those 5 buttons means you can control everything on this watch from the buttons, and you do not have to use the touchscreen most of the time unless you want to. So if it's raining out or you've got sweaty hands or something like that, you've got full control. Flipping the watches over here, you're gonna notice another similarity between these 3 watches. First of all, the new Polar Vantage M3 on the left here does have an industry standard 22 millimeter quick release band, so you can pop this off with your fingernail and replace it from a bunch of different options on Amazon or even direct from Polar. And if you look at the center of the watches here, all 3 of these watches, between the M3, the V3, and the Grid X2 Pro, feature the same optical heart rate sensor in the middle here. That is the Polar Elixir technology. It's got the biosensing with the wrist temperature detection. You've got the heart rate sensor, the optical SpO2 sensor, and that's all built into that little bump on the back of the watch here. And we'll talk more on heart rate accuracy later in this video. Jumping back to the front of the watch here, I want to move the Vantage V3 and the Grid X2 Pro aside for a minute and bring back the old classic, the Polar Vantage M2 here. Now, one of the biggest drawbacks on the Polar Vantage M2, the last generation of the M series, was the display. The M2 featured an MIP or memory in pixel display. However, it was one of the dimmest, darkest, hardest to read MIP displays I've ever tested on this channel, and I've tested a lot of watches on this channel. As you can see here, with the backlight off in a well-lit studio environment, I have to angle this watch kind of towards the light just to be able to read the time of day, and that's a thing of the past, because on the new Polar Vantage M3, they've included a new 1.23-inch AMOLED touch-enabled display, and if you hold these two watches side by side, it's literally a night and day difference between these two, because the new AMOLED display on the M3 gets up to 1000 nits of peak brightness. It's super easy to read in just about any lighting environment, including indoors or even outdoors in direct sunlight. Now that we've talked about the hardware, let's dive into the user interface and some of the smartwatch features on this watch. So just like on the Polar Vantage V3 and the Grid X2 Pro, again, it shares the same software and it's got the same user interface. So if you have a Polar watch like the Grid X2 Pro or the V3, you're going to be very at home here. As you can see from the watch face, I can simply swipe left or right to start cycling through my widgets here. I've got my activity for the day. Of course, I can tap in on that and get even more detail about my step count, my calories burned, my heart rate data, and more. Swiping over again, we've got my sleep tracking and nightly recharge, which is a really nice feature of Polar watches. As you can see, I did not sleep great last night. I was up late editing. I've got a sick kid right now. So as you can see, I've got compromised sleep, unfortunately. Swiping over again, we've got my boost from sleep, and this is sort of how much energy you've gained from the night before. Swiping over again, we've got my cardio load status or training load, and this is super useful as well if you're a runner or a cyclist or someone like that. Swiping over one more time, we've got our music controls, and as you can see, I was watching a DC Rainmaker video on my phone, and I can also swipe up from the bottom of the screen to see all of my phone notifications. Here you can see I've got a random notification from some spam. That's always fun. Now keep in mind your text messages and Instagram messages and phone calls and everything will pop up here. However, you can't respond to those. You can't like reply to a message or anything like that. It's only for reading out your notifications. So that's sort of the smartwatch features of the Polar Vantage M3. Again, identical to the Grid X2 Pro and Vantage V3. Now if we tap the lower left button here, it's going to drop us into sort of the training menu. So here I can select a workout. I can scroll down, I can do a breathing exercise called Serene. I can scroll down and see my Strava live segments, my fueling strategies, timers and stopwatches and things like that. We've got our tests here, which are built-in fitness tests. And here in the settings is also where you compare third-party accessories as well, whether that be a heart rate sensor or a power meter on your bike. Jumping back to the top of this menu, we get to our training menu. And if I tap in on this, you're gonna find we have an absolute crapload of options when it comes to training. Got everything from running to cycling to hiking to biking. You've got ultra running profiles and triathlon profiles. There's like 150 different activities to choose from. If I do start a running workout, you can see here's an example of a data page. Again, this is customizable if you want to change how it looks and what information you see. But for me, I've got my heart rate, my distance, my pace, and the duration of the activity. And then here we've got the map page. And as you can see, we do have a full color detail map available on the Polar Vantage M3, just like what you'd find on the Polar Vantage V3, which is a much more expensive watch. These are offline maps that you can download directly to the storage of the watch. There's 32 gigabytes of internal storage on the Polar Vantage M3, and that's only for mapping. Like I said, there's no music storage or anything like that, so all of that storage is only for maps. Keep in mind, even though there's full color offline mapping on the Polar Vantage M3, these are not routable maps. So you can't like choose a destination and have the watch generate turn-by-turn directions to get there directly on your wrist. You do have to design the course in something like Komoot or Strava or something like that, and then pull that data into the Polar Flow app on your phone in order to sync it over to your watch. You can get turn-by-turn navigation if you use something like Komoot, but you can't generate that on the fly on the watch when you're out on the run. Even though the maps are not routable on the Polar Vantage M3, having a map available on the watch is quite useful, and it's good to have context of your surroundings. If you're on a hike, for example, you can see whether the trail forks right or left, and you can kind of make a decision based on just looking at the image of the map. With navigation and mapping out of the way, let's move on to battery life on the Polar Vantage M3. On paper, on the spec sheet, the Polar Vantage M3 claims up to 7 days of typical use. Now, in my use case so far, again, I've only had the watch for a few days, I'm right in line with that 7 days of use, and I have been using it every day for at least 30 minutes of a GPS activity. So their 7-day claim does seem fairly accurate. Now in a GPS activity, when you're out on a run and you're using the default performance mode, which is sort of the highest accuracy you can get out of this watch, you'll get 30 hours in a GPS activity, which is actually pretty good. That should be long enough for a lot of people to complete something like a 100-mile ultramarathon. Speaking of GPS accuracy, let's talk about that now. now. The new Polar Vantage M3 is multi-band enabled. That's sort of the gold standard these days when it comes to GPS watches. That means it can see multiple satellites at a given time on different frequencies to establish a more precise position. And that's actually the same technology that's used by the Polar Vantage V3 and the Grid X2 Pro as well, which again are much more expensive watches. So how does that compare when in my real life testing so far? Honestly, I've only had the watch for a few days, like I said, but I've taken it on a few runs, and I've been surprised by the results. They're actually looking pretty good. The lines look pretty crisp and comparable to much more expensive watches like the Garmin Fenix 8, which is a multi-band enabled watch, and even the Apple Watch Ultra 2. Again, I've only had it for a few days, and I need to do way more testing to come to a complete conclusion, but initial reaction to the GPS accuracy I'm seeing so far is pretty good, even though I haven't been in challenging conditions like in a slot canyon or in a big city with buildings or anything like that. I've been in the suburbs, so it's sort of the best case scenario, so take that for what it's worth. With GPS accuracy out of the way, let's talk about the heart rate sensor accuracy on the back here. Again, pleasantly surprised on the Polar Vantage M3. In my testing so far, after a few different runs, the heart rate sensor accuracy on the M3 is looking surprisingly good. I've been comparing it directly with an ECG sensor, an electrocardiogram that I wear on my chest, which is super accurate and what I use as a baseline of comparison. And as you can see on the graphs, it's pretty comparable. It's right in line with my ECG sensor, and that's good to see. That's all you can ask for. Again, it's still early days. I need to do more testing, but initial reaction is looking good in terms of heart rate accuracy. And that brings us to the next segment of this video, where I want to talk about the future of the Polar Vantage M3, the Grid X2 Pro, and the Vantage V3, because Polar has announced that they have a huge firmware update coming out they're calling Firmware 3.0, and it affects all of these watches. Now, the Polar Vantage V3 and the Grid X2 Pro will be the first devices to get Firmware 3.0, but further down the road, we'll see that same firmware on the M3 as well. So what does Firmware 3.0 entail? I don't have it here, I can't show you, but I do have some screenshots to show you. And as you can see, the first thing they've done is overhauled the exercise selection menu. So now you can scroll through multiple activities with a single swipe and get to where you need to be. You don't need to scroll individually through each page. You can scroll through a whole list until you get to that activity you want to select and select it, which I do appreciate. On top of the exercise selection menu, they've also overhauled a couple of different aspects of the user interface to make it feel a little bit modern. Like there's new watch face complications that are not just round, they're also oval shaped and squared, and you can add more complications to a watch face rather than the limited selection you can now. They've also added a Find My Phone feature in Firmware 3.0, which is super useful and something I use all the time on my Apple Watches and my Garmin's. And probably the most exciting thing coming in Firmware 3.0 is point of interest support in mapping and navigation on Polar watches. That means on the map, when you're hiking or out in the woods, you'll see nearby shelters and water sources and campsites, and you'll be able to filter them out using a menu on your watch to see where the things are around you. And on top of Firmware 3.0, Polar has also been working with additional partners to add functionality to their watches as well. And most notably, they're also working with Training Peaks. If you don't know what Training Peaks is, it's probably the biggest training platform out there where you can have like a coach building a workout for you, and that syncs over to Training Peaks, and then you can download that to your watch and execute it. It's a really nice platform. So where does that leave us on the Polar Vantage M3? Well, I'm a little bit perplexed on this watch because as you can see, as I go through the specs of this watch, it's basically the exact same watch as the Polar Vantage V3, the Grid X2 Pro, just in a smaller, cheaper form factor, which is something I do appreciate. But I think the bigger question here when it comes to Vantage M3 is how it compares in the landscape of watches right now. You've got watches out there from Garmin, like the Forerunner 265, that falls in a similar price point at around $449. And that watch has arguably more useful wellness features like body battery and stress tracking. And finally, and probably the most compelling alternative to the Polar Vantage M3 is going to be the Suunto Race S, because that watch has a lot in common with the Polar Vantage M3 and some advantages over the M3, and it's $50 cheaper, coming in at $349. However, if you are a Polar fan and you really like Polar watches and you're in the ecosystem, and maybe you're someone who's hung on to the Polar Vantage M2 for the past few years and you're looking for an upgrade path that doesn't break the bank, the Polar Vantage M3 is actually a pretty solid option for $399. It's got good build quality, you've got the Polar ecosystem phone, the Polar Flow app, you've got mapping and navigation, and all of the wellness features and sleep tracking that Polar is known for in a pretty attractive looking package. I guess the real question is, how hardcore of a Polar fan are you to go for this watch with so many other options out there at a similar price point? And that's where I want to turn it over to you in the comments down below. Let me know what you think of the Polar Vantage M3 and how it compares to all the other devices on the market right now. Is the Suunto Race S a better option in your opinion? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear from you. And after you're done commenting down there, also check out the links in the description down below where you can head over and pick up a Polar Vantage M3 or any other watch I talked about in this video. And after you're done shopping, also check out the links over to my other social media accounts, my Strava, my Instagram, my Threads account, and my podcast, along with my merch store where you can pick up a sweet running hat or a t-shirt or all of the other things I offer. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did enjoy it, please consider giving me a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel down below, because only like 10% of you are actually subscribed, so just subscribe. It makes me feel better, and I'll see you in the next one, okay? Bye!